The air in the observatory dome always felt thin, even when the pressure gauges insisted otherwise. A perpetual chill clung to the metal catwalks and the massive, silent dish above, a cold that seeped into my bones no matter how many layers I wore. I preferred it that way. The isolation was a crucible burning away distractions, leaving only the endless, patient vigil of the cosmos. Tonight, the hum of the servers was a low, steady thrum against the stillness, a mechanical heartbeat in the vast quiet. I was chasing ghosts, or rather the absence of them. My focus was on the Eridanus Supervoid, a colossal stretch of space where galaxy clusters simply weren't. It was an anomaly in itself, a cosmic desert, a place where the universe seemed to have forgotten to put anything. For years, conventional wisdom held it as truly empty, a vacuum on a scale that dwarfed human comprehension. But my new generation deep space observatory, the Sentinel, boasted optics and receivers that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, designed to catch the faintest whispers from the very edge of existence. My fingers danced across the holographic interface, adjusting filters, recalibrating sensitivity. The data stream flowed, a flood of numbers and spectral graphs, each one a pixelated window into unimaginable distances. What I found instead was different. It started as a flicker, a barely perceptible spike on a frequency I designated for background cosmic noise. I dismissed it, a stray electron, a solar flare pinging off a distant satellite. The universe was a messy place, full of static. I ran a quick diagnostic on the primary receiver, all green. I checked the secondary, also green. Not as a spike this time, but a faint, undulating pattern. A low frequency, almost infrasonic, yet it painted itself across the visible spectrum in a way that defied explanation. It wasn't random. There was a rhythm, a complexity that didn't fit any known astrophysical phenomenon. It pulsed, then shifted, a series of elongated blips and brief, sharp staccatos, like an impossibly slow alien language. "No," I muttered, leaning closer to the console, my breath fogging the cool glass. "That's impossible." I ran the sequence again, feeding the raw data into the pattern recognition algorithms. The system, designed to identify pulsars, quasars, even the faintest gamma-ray bursts, choked. It flagged the signature as unknown, then non-terrestrial, and finally, after struggling for a full 30 seconds, simply anomaly. The red warning light on the diagnostic panel began to blink, a persistent, irritating throb. My first thought was equipment malfunction. Always the first thought. The Sentinel was cutting edge, but bleeding-edge technology often had its quirks. I initiated a full system reboot, watched the indicators cycle through their self-checks, the hum of the servers momentarily deepening before returning to their steady drone. The screen went blank, then flickered back to life, the familiar star charts blossoming across the interface. I navigated back to the Eridanus Supervoid, zeroed in on the exact coordinates. The signal was still there. Faint, yes, but undeniably present. This wasn't noise. Noise was chaotic. This had structure. It wasn't repeating in any discernible cycle, ruling out a natural stellar object. It was evolving. Each subsequent pulse, each subtle shift in frequency was unique, never quite the same as the last. It was like listening to a conversation where every word was new, yet undeniably part of a coherent whole. I felt a sudden tightness in my chest, a physical reaction I hadn't expected. My hands, usually steady, hovered above the keyboard, reluctant to touch. This was beyond unusual. It was unprecedented. Every scientific instinct screamed for a rational explanation, yet every logical pathway led to a dead end. This felt like that, but magnified by light years. Could it be interference from a known source, cleverly disguised? I cross-referenced the signal with every catalog of known celestial objects, every satellite trajectory, every piece of space junk. Nothing, absolutely nothing matched. The signal was clean, pristine, emerging from a vacuum that should have been utterly silent. My rational mind, the mind of a scientist, urged me to dismiss it, to flag it as an unidentifiable error and move on. It was late. I was tired. Perhaps a coffee, a fresh perspective in the morning. But something held me captive. A strange, insistent pull. It wasn't curiosity in the academic sense. not entirely. It was a deeper, more primal urge, a sense of having stumbled upon something profoundly significant, something that hummed just beneath the threshold of human understanding. I knew I couldn't ignore it, not truly. Even if it was a ghost demanding attention. I adjusted the recording parameters, ensuring the raw data, every single incomprehensible blip and undulation, was meticulously logged. The red warning light on the diagnostic panel continued its rhythmic blink, a silent accusation. What had I just committed to memory? And what would it demand in return? Its deep Earth isolation and minimal electromagnetic interference made it the perfect, albeit unorthodox, site for my experimental deep space observatory. My colleagues, back in the bright, sterile labs above ground, had laughed. "Raj, I'll rust down there," one had quipped, oblivious to the damp, metallic tang that was already a permanent fixture in my nostrils. I preferred the silence, the oppressive weight of rock above me, to their polite skepticism. My real work began after midnight, when the last of the surface chatter faded. That's when the new generation sensors, jury-rigged with repurposed government surplus, would pierce the veil of the cosmos, seeking the faint echoes of creation's dawn. For weeks, it had been the expected cosmic background noise, the familiar hum of distant galaxies, the rhythmic pulse of quasars, predictable, until it wasn't. The anomaly appeared without fanfare, a single spike on the otherwise placid data stream. Not from a star, not a galaxy, not even a nebula. It emanated from a region of space so utterly empty, so devoid of even hydrogen atoms, that it was simply known as the Great Void, a place where nothing should be. My first thought was it was a small, insistent pulse in the vast quiet of the observatory, a counterpoint to the profound stillness that had fallen after the system confirmed the log. And what would it demand of me? The question lingered, a chill breath on my neck, even as I leaned closer to the monitor, my fingers tracing the spectral lines of the signal data. I spent the next few days in a haze, the lines of code and the abstract patterns of the signal blurring into a single, insistent hum in my mind. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford, not with this cosmic whisper demanding my full attention. The signal wasn't just data anymore. It was a presence, subtle but pervasive. I felt it, a low thrumming beneath the surface of my consciousness, even when I stepped away from the main console, even when I tried to focus on mundane tasks like brewing another pot of stale coffee. My colleagues, bless their oblivious hearts, just saw me as Raj, deep in one of his obsessions. They'd nod, offer a polite greeting, and move on, leaving me to my strange communion. The first hint that something was truly amiss beyond my own perception came not from the signal itself, but from the equipment. It was subtle at first. The overhead fluorescent lights in my small analysis bay flickered, not in the usual power grid way, but with an uneven, almost stuttering rhythm. Then the hum from the cooling fans on my secondary server rack began to waver, dipping in pitch, then rising like a tired vocalist losing control. I checked the power supply, ran diagnostics. Everything came back clean. A phantom glitch, I decided, attributing it to the aging infrastructure of the observatory, but it persisted. The monitors would occasionally blip, a momentary scramble of pixels, like static on an old television. My tablet, usually so reliable, would freeze for a fraction of a second, its screen momentarily displaying a fragmented, indecipherable pattern, before snapping back to normal. The air in the room, usually kept at a stable, cool temperature, sometimes felt strangely heavy, almost viscous, as if a profound pressure had settled around me. I'd rub my temples, convinced it was just fatigue playing tricks. Then the sound started. A low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate not from any specific device, but from the very structure of the building. It was a sound that resonated in my bones, a deep, almost infrasonic drone that shifted the ambient noise of the observatory. The distant clatter of the kitchen staff, the murmur of voices from the main control room, they all seemed to recede, muffled by this pervasive, unidentifiable hum. Like a language I almost understood, but not quite. I'd cock my head, strain my ears, but they would always vanish, leaving me with the persistent, unsettling hum. My skin would prickle. One evening, staring at the signal's intricate waveform on a large display, it happened. My vision warped, just for a blink. The lines on the screen seemed to ripple and flex, like tendrils reaching out, and the familiar geometry of my console dissolved into a swirling kaleidoscope of impassable colors. A shadow, not a shadow cast by light, but a deeper, fundamental absence, seemed to stretch from the corner of the room, elongating, twisting, then snapping back into nothingness. My breath caught in my throat. My heart gave a violent lurch, hammering against my ribs. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. Everything was normal. The lines were still, the console solid, the corner empty. Was I losing my grip? The incident shook me. It wasn't just an anomaly anymore. It felt like a direct assault on my perceptions. The signal, whatever it was bleeding into my reality. I needed context, something, anything to anchor myself. Pure astrophysics wasn't enough. I shifted my research, diving into obscure archives, dusty digital libraries, and forgotten scientific journals. I scoured databases for reports of unusual atmospheric phenomena, strange electromagnetic disturbances, anything that echoed the glitches and sensory distortions I was experiencing. It was a long, frustrating search, filled with dead ends and sensationalized hoaxes. Then, tucked away in a digitized collection of fringe geological surveys from the early 20th century, I found it. An obscure, sparsely referenced report detailing inexplicable events surrounding a glacier research camp. Ancient ice core reveals impassable age. The report, written in dry, academic language, spoke of anomalous sonic resonance emanating from deep within the ice, unexplained fluctuations in local magnetic fields, and transient, subjective visual distortions experienced by a few of the camp's researchers. It even hinted at strange, geometric patterns found etched into layers of ice that predated any known human civilization by millions of years. These weren't scientific papers. They were historical accounts, some bordering on myth, describing cults in various isolated corners of the world. These groups, often inhabiting remote, desolate regions, spoke of communing with an elder voice that spoke from beyond the stars, a presence that promised forbidden knowledge but often left its followers irrevocably changed, driven to acts of baffling self-destruction or profound, unsettling insight. The texts described the cultists experiencing visions, hearing sounds no one else could, and seeing patterns in reality that defied logical explanation. They spoke of a truth behind the veil, a reality so vast and terrifying that it fractured the minds of those who perceived it. The low, resonant hum I'd been hearing intensified, swelling into a palpable pressure against my eardrums. I could almost feel it vibrating against the bones of my skull. Not just echoes, but distinct, multi-layered voices, speaking in a language utterly alien, yet somehow familiar, like a half-forgotten dream. My eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing, only the familiar, inanimate equipment. My determination, usually a steadfast anchor, began to fray at the edges. This wasn't just a scientific puzzle anymore. The signal wasn't just a discovery. It felt like an invitation, and I was already inside the door. What had these ancient cults truly perceived? The red warning light from the diagnostic panel continued its slow, deliberate blink. Each pulse was a quiet accusation, a tiny, insistent rhythm in the vast, almost oppressive quiet of the observatory. I sat hunched over the terminal, the glow of the screen painting my face in stark, sickly green and blue. What had I logged? What impassable truth had I just committed to memory, etching it deeper into the system and into myself? The question had no answer, only a cold, spreading void in my gut. Sleep, when it finally came, offered no refuge. I found myself adrift in a landscape of impassable angles and non-Euclidean geometries, structures that defied 3 dimensions yet felt terrifyingly solid. There was no light, only a pervasive, deep violet gloom that seemed to absorb all sound. Yet I could feel a presence, an immense, unblinking awareness that stretched beyond any horizon I could conceive. It wasn't looking at me, not directly, but through me, past me, as if I were merely a translucent film over something far more significant. My breath hitched, not from lack of air, but from the crushing weight of that vast, silent gaze. It was a pressure on my chest, an ache behind my eyes. I tried to move to speak, but my limbs were lead, my voice a phantom. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate, not in my ears, but in my very skull, a frequency that felt ancient, primordial, shaking the fragile scaffolding of my perception. It was the sound of a truth too vast to comprehend, and it threatened to shatter me. My eyes darted around, searching for the impossible angles, the violet gloom, but found only the familiar, reassuring lines of monitors and instrument panels. The red warning lights still blinked. The world was solid. I ran a hand over my face, the skin clammy. Had I just dreamed, or had something breached the fragile membrane of my waking mind? The next few days blurred into a relentless cycle of caffeine and growing paranoia. I forced myself to focus on the signal, trying to find a pattern, a mathematical signature that would ground it in reality. But the numbers danced on the screen, marking me. They were too perfect, too complex, too alien. My concentration frayed. The hum from my dream would sometimes resurface, a low thrum that vibrated deep in my chest, making my vision swim. I'd blink, shake my head, and it would recede, leaving behind a faint ringing in my ears. Then came the waking visions. I was staring at a spectral analysis, lines of data scrolling past when the room seemed to ripple, just for an instant. The polished steel console warped, its edges blurring into impossible curves, then snapping back. The fluorescent lights flickered, not physically, but in my perception, shifting from their harsh white to a deep, unsettling indigo. My stomach lurched. I gripped the desk, grip tight. The air grew heavy, thick, as if the very atoms around me had become sluggish. I could feel a pressure building behind my eyes, a silent scream trying to force its way out. There was it, exhaustion, delirium. I pinched the bridge of my nose, forcing myself to take slow, deliberate breaths. When I opened my eyes again, the room was normal, mundane. But the lingering scent of ozone, a metallic tang that pricked at the back of my throat, was undeniably real. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Fleeting, geometric patterns, shifting like impossible fractals, just beyond the edge of my direct vision. I'd snap my head around, and they'd vanish, leaving only the dull gray of the observatory walls. My hands trembled when I tried to pour coffee. I was losing my grip. I knew it. But the signal, that insistent hum, it was still there, still calling. Driven by a desperate need to find any correlation, any anchor point for these unsettling experiences, I began a frantic search through obscure scientific archives. I pored over fringe theories, forgotten geological reports, anything that hinted at inexplicable anomalies. My fingers flew across the keyboard, fueled by a nervous energy that bordered on mania. And then I found it. An old, almost forgotten report, tucked away in a digital corner of a defunct geological survey. It detailed inexplicable energy signatures and crystalline structures found within an ancient ice core, specifically from the Glacier Research Camp. Ancient ice core reveals impossible age. The report had been largely dismissed due to its impossibly old dating, far beyond anything conventional science could explain. Not merely thousands, but millions of years, with properties that defied known physics. The words non-Euclidean patterns and anomalous energy resonance leaped out at me. As I read, the words on the screen began to swim. The hum returned, stronger this time, vibrating through the chair up my spine. The sterile white of the document shifted, tinged with that pervasive violet. I wasn't just reading about ancient ice, I was feeling it. My vision tunneled, the observatory fading, replaced by a boundless, frozen expanse. I saw colossal, jagged spires of ice, stretching into a sky of bruised purple, their surfaces etched with those impossible, shifting geometries. It wasn't a dream anymore. I gasped, struggling to pull air into my chest, but the air itself felt frozen, devoid of oxygen. I was there somehow amidst those ancient, terrifying structures. My grip on the desk tightened until my fingers ached. Is this what the signal was doing? There was it not just data, but a conduit. There was it shattering my mind, or merely revealing what was always there, lurking beneath the thin veneer of reality. I sat hunched over the terminal, the glow of the screen painting my face in stark, sickly green hues. My fingers, stiff with a persistent tremor, hovered over the keyboard. The data before me was irrefutable, yet entirely impossible. It pulsed with the same alien rhythm as that unforgivable light. My coffee mug, forgotten, had long gone cold beside a stack of printouts, each sheet covered in my frantic annotations. Circles, arrows, question marks that felt less like queries and more like pleas. The scent of stale coffee and ozone clung to the air, mingling with something else, something I couldn't quite place a faint, metallic tang, or perhaps just the product of my overtaxed mind. I hadn't left this room, not properly, in days. The world outside felt distant, unreal. Only the signal and its ever-deepening implications held any substance. I knew I had to share this, not just for validation, but because the weight of it was becoming crushing. This wasn't just an anomaly. It was a revelation that shredded every assumption about the universe. I compiled my findings, stripping away my more elaborate theories, trying to present only the raw data, the undeniable facts of the signal's origin, its incredible complexity, its impassable age. I practiced my presentation in the dead of night, muttering to the empty chairs, trying to sound reasonable, calm, persuasive. My colleagues sat arrayed around the long conference table, their faces a mixture of polite skepticism and thinly veiled impatience. A senior researcher, whose published works I'd once admired, adjusted his spectacles, his gaze drifting over my disheveled appearance before settling on the screen. I started speaking, my voice scratchy at first, then gaining a desperate clarity. I laid out the spectral analysis, the impassable phase coherence, the sheer informational density emanating from what should have been empty space. Coherent, I explained, my hand gesturing wildly at the projections. It's not a natural phenomenon, it's a structure, an intelligence, beyond anything we've ever conceived. A younger colleague, usually quick to offer counter-theories, simply shifted in his seat, avoiding my eyes. The senior researcher cleared his throat. Raj, we appreciate the enthusiasm, but what I read describing it borders on speculation. Without any corroborating evidence, this is simply too far-fetched. A miscalibration, perhaps, an interference pattern. I felt a heart flush rise to my neck. I've checked every possible variable, every instrument, every mathematical model. There's no error. The signal is real and it's changing, learning. Silence descended, thick and suffocating. The air in the room grew heavy, not with the weight of my words, but with their rejection. They saw not a groundbreaking discovery, but a man unraveling. I could feel their collective judgment, a quiet dismissal that stung more than any outright argument. They looked at me with a careful pity, the kind reserved for those who had lost their way. My emails went unanswered. Invitations to research colloquiums stopped appearing in my inbox. The isolation wasn't just internal anymore, it was external, palpable. My laboratory became a solitary cell, its walls absorbing my desperate murmurs, echoing only the persistent, impassable hum of the signal data. They thought I was losing my mind. Perhaps I was. It had opened a door, and I felt a horrifying compulsion to step through. If mainstream science couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge it, then I would have to look elsewhere. I began to haunt the university's lesser-known archives, the dusty corners of the library where forgotten lore resided. I felt like an archaeologist, sifting through cultural debris for a fossil of the impossible. My search led me down strange paths, through esoteric philosophies and forgotten belief systems. I found references to elder truths, to cosmic sleepers, to unfathomable architects of reality. Then, buried deep within a forgotten collection of geographical survey reports and geological findings from the early 20th century, I found it. A brittle, yellow document detailing an expedition to a remote Arctic region. The report spoke of a glacier research camp. Ancient ice core reveals impassable age. My breath hitched. The accompanying analysis, though rudimentary by today's standards, described anomalies within the ice layers, not just microscopic organisms or atmospheric gas trapped for millennia, but something else. The core samples, taken from incredible depths, showed an unnaturally uniform stratification, almost too perfect for natural formation. And within the deepest, oldest layers, they'd found faint, regular patterns, like an impassable pulse embedded in the ice. The dating, even with the primitive technology of the time, had indicated an age far exceeding any known geological or even biological timeline. The original researchers, unable to explain it, had simply noted it as an unclassified geological phenomenon and moved on. A hum that seemed to emanate not from the ice itself, but through it from something immeasurably older. What had those forgotten explorers truly uncovered, entombed within the ancient ice? Whisper, just at the edge of audibility, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated in my teeth. Was it the signal manifesting, or was I simply exhausted, my mind playing tricks in this subterranean tomb? My heart would pound, a frantic drum against my ribs, convinced for a fleeting moment that I wasn't alone. Then came the visions, fleeting, vivid flashes, not dreams, but waking hallucinations, like brief windows into another reality. A glimpse of impassable geometries etched onto the bunker's rough-hewn stone, or the sudden, overwhelming sensation of falling through an infinite, starless void. I'd blink, shake my head, and the mundane reality of the control room would snap back into place, leaving me disoriented and breathless. Driven by a desperate need for context, I started exploring the bunker's forgotten archives. One log entry, dated 1978, chilled me to the bone. The deep space array is picking up something, not natural. Patterns indicate intelligence, but of a nature utterly alien. The personnel are reporting vivid dreams. Some are speaking in tongues. The project lead has begun to draw impassable diagrams on the walls. I fear we have awakened something. The next page was blank. The rest of the folder contained only transfer orders for the remaining staff, and then silence. What happened to them? Why was their research abruptly terminated and their findings buried? 4. The cracks in reality, the signal stopped being just data on a screen. It became a direct intrusion, an uninvited guest in the deepest recesses of my mind. My dreams were no longer my own. They were vast, echoing landscapes of impassable scale, where gravity was a forgotten concept and light bent around unseen forces. Worst were the presences. Not physical forms, but colossal, indifferent ideas that permeated these dreamscapes. They were ancient beyond reckoning, older than stars, older than time itself, and their awareness of me was no more significant than my awareness of a single dust mote in a cosmic storm. I would wake in a cold sweat, gasping for air in the suffocating darkness of my bunk, the echoes of those alien geometries still burning behind my eyelids. The waking visions intensified too. Sometimes, the bunker walls would shimmer, revealing not concrete, but a glimpse of the void itself, teeming with a silent, writhing chaos. The air would grow impassably heavy, tasting of ozone and something else, something metallic and utterly alien, pressing down on me until my chest ached. I'd grip the console, my grip tight, struggling to anchor myself to the familiar, mundane reality, but it felt increasingly flimsy, a thin veil over something vast and terrifying. My reflection in the monitor became a stranger's face, gaunt, eyes wide with a manic intensity I barely recognized. Was this the face of a man unraveling, or a man seeing truths others couldn't bear? The line blurred, thinned, threatened to vanish entirely. I'd find myself muttering to the screens, arguing with the biting wind, howled outside the corrugated metal walls of the research station, a constant, rasping complaint against the thin barrier separating me from the Antarctic night. Inside, the generator thrummed, its mechanical heartbeat a false comfort in the cold, sterile air of the temporary lab at the Glacier Research Camp. Ancient ice core reveals impassable age. My fingers, still numb despite the thick gloves, moved with a practiced slowness over the console. I had been chasing that subtle hum for days, an elusive tremor buried deep within the data from the ice core sensors. It wasn't a geological vibration. It wasn't atmospheric. It was different. The senior researcher had tried to dissuade me, muttering about overwork and the peculiar acoustics of deep ice, but I knew. I felt it in the static electricity that prickled my skin when I stood near the core sample, in the phantom pressure behind my eyes. This wasn't just an anomaly. It was a beckoning. I had recalibrated the subsonic detectors, bypassing the filters meant to screen out natural frequencies. What I sought wasn't natural. The old team, the ones who had vanished before my arrival, they must have heard it too. Their final report, salvaged from a buried data log, spoke of a growing unease, a sense of being watched from within the very ice. I shivered, not from the cold, but from the memory of their cryptic notes. I adjusted the amplitude, then the phase, trying to isolate the specific frequency band the last report mentioned. The screen flickered, a mess of green lines and numerical noise. Then, a single, unwavering spike pierced through the chaos. It pulsed, a slow, deliberate rhythm that resonated not just through the equipment, but through the bones in my chest. I felt a sudden, dizzying lightness, as if the oxygen had thinned. My ears rang, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the generator, the wind, everything. My vision blurred at the edges, the fluorescent lights of the lab seeming to recede into a distant, hazy glow. The hum wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a pressure, building, expanding, filling the space inside my skull. I felt my lungs tighten, a gasp catching in my throat. I tried to pull my hand back from the console, to break the connection, but my muscles refused to obey. A strange, compelling warmth spread through my fingertips, crawling up my arm, a current of pure, alien thought. It wasn't a language I understood, not in words. It was a flood of raw information, an unbidden download directly into the core of my being. My mind reeled, assaulted by concepts that tore at the very fabric of my perception. I saw, no, I felt, a vastness. It was a tapestry woven from strands of time and causality, each thread humming with an impassable complexity. My human brain struggled to reconcile the scale of it, the sheer volume of its existence. It was not a physical form, no limbs, no eyes, no mouth. It was a presence, an intelligence so utterly colossal that the universe itself seemed a mere ripple in its incomprehensible awareness. My knees buckled. I slumped against the console, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The pressure in my head intensified, a silent scream of data that threatened to split my skull. I was a single drop of water trying to comprehend the entirety of an ocean, and the ocean was pouring itself into me, unconcerned with my fragile capacity. It was pure consciousness, ancient beyond reckoning, an entity that had observed the birth and death of galaxies as fleeting moments. And it was here. My understanding of reality shattered, shards of my own limited perceptions falling away like brittle glass. How could anything be so vast, and yet so intimately present? The overwhelming influx began to coalesce into a terrifying clarity. It was showing me its purpose, not explaining it. I perceived a slow, deliberate alteration of what I had always considered fundamental. The universe, in its true state, was not fixed. It was a malleable thing, a clay constantly being kneaded, reshaped by something beyond human comprehension. The stars, the nebulae, the very laws of physics, all were subject to this silent, glacial process. My species, humanity, our brief, frantic existence on a speck of dust, was utterly irrelevant. We were less than dust motes, less than a whisper in a hurricane, unnoticed by the vast, slumbering architect of reality. It wasn't about our extinction. It was about our absolute insignificance, our utter lack of place in the grand design. This entity wasn't malicious. It simply was. And its purpose was not to destroy us, but to continue its slow, inevitable reshaping, a process that would casually sweep away our entire civilization without a second thought, without even a flicker of acknowledgement. We were an ephemeral, accidental byproduct of its cosmic carpentry. My vision cleared, but the world had irrevocably changed. My hands trembled, my body ached as if I had run for days. What would happen when its reshaping touched our fragile reality more directly? I hadn't slept properly in days, maybe weeks. The distinction had blurred into a single, aching continuum. My eyes, gritty and bloodshot, were fixed on the monitors, not the ones displaying the latest signal data, but the ones connected to the outside world, the ones that had begun to show me things I couldn't unsee. The first anomalies were subtle, easily dismissed as glitches in the global network. Flickering satellite feeds from distant continents, brief moments of static that didn't align with any known solar activity. Then came the reports. Not scientific papers, not even news articles, but fragmented whispers on obscure forums, desperate calls on emergency channels. Strange auroras, people said, shimmering in latitudes where no such light should dance. Not the greens and purples of the magnetic poles, but hues of bruised ochre and sickly yellow, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm that seemed to echo the very signal I had unearthed. I watched a live feed from a remote Alaskan village, the reporter's voice tight with a fear she tried to mask. Behind her, the sky above the snow-dusted peaks bled with an impassable, sickly luminescence. It wasn't just light. It felt like a presence, a vast, silent intake of breath. I could feel it, even here, thousands of miles away, isolated by ice and ocean. This wasn't just a phenomenon, it was an extension. The entity, once confined to the void, once merely a whisper in the cosmic background, was now bleeding into the atmosphere, painting the world with its terrible presence. He kept running a hand over his thinning hair, a nervous habit I hadn't noticed until recently. "The seismic readings," he mumbled, pointing to a graph that showed minor, unexplainable tremors across multiple fault lines, not severe enough to cause damage. Constant, like a low, persistent thrum beneath the Earth's crust. There, everywhere, not concentrated, just a global hum. He didn't connect it to my work, not overtly, but his gaze kept darting to my screens, to the strange atmospheric phenomena, to the reports of widespread unease. He knew, I think, that something was profoundly wrong, even if he couldn't articulate the what. The psychological shifts were far more disturbing than the atmospheric displays. Initial reports spoke of heightened anxiety in urban centers, a sudden, inexplicable surge in reported nightmares, vivid and unsettling, shared by strangers across continents. Then it escalated. Mass hysteria in a coastal town in Japan, people abandoning their homes in a frantic rush, convinced the ocean was rising, though no tide charts supported it. A quiet village in Switzerland, its inhabitants suddenly gripped by a communal delusion, began to meticulously dismantle their own houses, brick by brick, piling the rubble into strange, geometric mounds in the town square. They worked silently, tirelessly, their faces blank. I saw a video, shaky and grainy, uploaded by a terrified local. The villagers moved with an unsettling coordination, their eyes wide and unseeing, their movements precise yet utterly devoid of human intent. It was like watching a colony of insects, driven by a single alien impulse. My stomach clenched. This wasn't merely fear. It was a repatterning of thought, a subtle, insidious resculpting of the human mind. The signal, the presence, it wasn't just out there anymore. It was in here, in the fragile architecture of human consciousness. It clung to the air in the research station, thick and cloying, a taste like old pennies on my tongue. My own thoughts, once a sanctuary of logic and reason, felt tainted, permeable. I could almost hear the low thrum of the entity, a resonant frequency in the deepest parts of my own brain, echoing the global hum the geologist mentioned. I was an unwilling conduit, a receiver, amplifying the subtle shifts that were reshaping the world. My understanding, once a source of pride, now felt like a curse, stripping away the comforting illusion of ignorance. I saw the strings, felt the puppet master's distant pull, and the clarity of it was a searing pain. The world wasn't just experiencing strange weather. It was undergoing a fundamental change, a transformation I could only describe as a thinning of the veil. The boundaries between what was real and what was merely perceived were dissolving, and the entity was pouring through the cracks. It was no longer a signal. It was an unfolding reality, a new layer of existence being laid over our own, thin and translucent, allowing the monstrous truth to bleed through. What would happen when the veil finally tore completely? The biting wind still howled outside the corrugated metal walls of the research station, a constant, rasping complaint against the thin barrier separating me from the Antarctic night. My fingers, numb despite the heated gloves, traced the lines of the last printout, the impassable signal signature. It pulsed on the page, not with light, but with a kind of visual insistence that made my eyes ache. I hadn't slept in days. The fatigue was a lead weight in my bones, but my mind raced, sharp and cold, like the air outside. A colleague, bundled in thick thermal gear, shuffled past my console, his face a mask of weary concern. We were here for ice, for climate data, for the mundane truths of geology. Instead, we'd found something else. It started subtly, a shimmer in my peripheral vision, gone before I could focus. A faint, high-pitched whine that seemed to resonate in my teeth, not quite a sound, more a pressure. But then the ice began to change. I was inspecting the core samples, the ancient cylinders of frozen time we'd painstakingly extracted. They lay in their refrigerated trays, pristine and silent. I leaned closer to a section marked 1, 2 million years BP, a particularly interesting stratum that had shown anomalous isotopic ratios. As I peered at the milky white ice, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the sample. Not a vibration from the camp, but something internal. The crystalline structure, usually uniform, began to shift. Tiny, geometric patterns, impossibly sharp and intricate, bloomed within the ice, twisting and reforming like a slow-motion kaleidoscope. They weren't cracks. They were structures, shapes that defied the very nature of water, of crystal. My breath hitched. I reached out a gloved finger, hesitating just above the surface. The patterns intensified, spiraling inward, creating an illusion of impassable depth. It was like looking into a window that opened onto something utterly alien, something that didn't belong in our reality. My hand trembled. I straightened, blinking, the impassable geometries in the ice momentarily fading, replaced by the mundane, familiar frost. He stood a few feet away, holding a mug of steaming coffee, his brow furrowed. I looked like I've seen a ghost. Everything all right with the core samples? I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. Yes, just a trick of the light, I suppose. My voice sounded thin, reedy. I didn't want to tell him, not yet, not until I understood. How could I explain that the very fabric of the ancient ice was reweaving itself into impassable forms? He'd think I was cracking under the pressure. Maybe I was, but I knew what I had seen. Later, in the cramped sleeping quarters, the distortions intensified. The bunk bed across from mine seemed to subtly lengthen, then shorten, then twist, its metal frame briefly forming a non-Euclidean curve before snapping back to normal. My eyes ached from trying to reconcile what I saw with what I knew to be true. I squeezed them shut, pressing the heels of my hands against my eyelids, trying to push the images away. When I opened them again, the small, framed photo of my family on the bedside table had changed. The faces were still theirs, but the background, a familiar park, was now subtly wrong. The trees were too tall, their branches reaching into a sky that was a shade of bruised purple I'd never seen. And behind them, barely visible, was a structure. It was the same impassable geometry I'd seen in the ice. It was bleeding into my memories, into the very fabric of my personal reality. A low hum, deeper than the generator, vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was in the air, in the walls. It felt like the entire glacier research camp. Ancient ice core reveals impassable age was a tuning fork, resonating with a frequency that was slowly, inexorably pulling our world apart. This wasn't just a signal anymore. This was a presence. It was here. I got up, pulling on my boots, my movements stiff and clumsy. I had to go back to the lab. I had to see the signal, confirm what I already knew. The world was unraveling, and I was watching it happen. Was I the only one? What would happen when the world finally noticed? The cold in the glacier research camp, ancient ice core reveals impassable age, had always been a constant, a dull ache in my bones that I'd learned to ignore. Now, it felt different. It was no longer an external force. It seeped into my thoughts, a crystalline lattice forming within my skull, sharp and intricate. The colleague, a burly man whose name I couldn't quite recall, had tried to talk to me earlier, his voice a muffled drone against the hum of the core sample machinery. I'd nodded, pretending to listen, but my gaze kept drifting back to the ice. The ancient ice core glowed with an internal light that only I could see. Not a phosphorescence, not a reflection of the lab lights, but a light born from within its impassable age, a silent, pulsating thrum. I'd spent days, weeks, staring at it, tracing the lines that weren't lines, the patterns that defied geometry. The colleague had called them fractures, impurities. He tapped the protective casing, his brow furrowed with concern. I saw only the unfolding of an infinite tapestry, each microscopic inclusion a star, each vein a galaxy, all reweaving themselves into impassable forms. My fingers, numb despite the heated gloves, hovered inches from the core. The cold radiated from it now, a focused beam that pierced the thick plastic, then the insulated fabric, then my skin. It felt like my blood was slowing, thickening, turning to a viscous, light-absorbing gel within my veins. My breath hitched. The signal. It was no longer something I merely detected with instruments. It resonated in my bones. It was a language not of sound, but of pure structural information, rewriting the very code of reality around me. The colleague had left, muttering something about a shift change, his footsteps crunching away on the frozen floor. Good. I needed to be alone. I needed to listen. My eyes burned. They felt like they were expanding, absorbing more light than they should, seeing beyond the visible spectrum. The air shimmered. The sturdy metal framework of the lab benches seemed to flex, to breathe, their atomic structures revealing themselves as vast, empty spaces punctuated by fleeting, impassable energies. The very concept of solid was a lie. Everything was vibration, a fleeting arrangement of nothingness. I reached out slowly, my hand trembling. It wasn't hard. It was fluid. It rippled under my touch like water, like smoke. My skin tingled, then burned, then felt nothing at all. I was no longer touching the ice. I was merging with it. A sound like grinding stones, but originating from deep within my own skull, reverberated through me. It was the sound of my perception shifting, of the old reality tearing away. My teeth ached. My jaw clenched. I felt a tremendous pressure, as if my skull were a fragile shell about to crack open, not from force, but from the sheer volume of information pouring into me. It wasn't pain, not exactly. It was an overwhelming presence, ancient and indifferent, unfurling within the confines of my mind. The cosmic truth. It wasn't a discovery. It was an infection, a revelation that consumed the host. I saw the universe now, not as a collection of stars and galaxies, but as the skin of something unimaginably vast, something that slept, its dreams rippling through existence. They were the spaces between its breaths, the silent, terrifying expanse of its slumber and the signal. My body felt alien. My limbs were heavy yet weightless. My breath became shallow, unnecessary. I was no longer Raj, the astrophysicist. That self was a discarded skin, a memory. I was a vessel, a receiver, an antenna tuned to a frequency that shattered sanity. The colleague's voice, now returning, a distant, worried shout, sounded like a forgotten language, meaningless. He was still trapped in the old reality, the tiny, comforting lie. I turned slowly. My neck felt stiff, unused. The colleague stood at the entrance to the core chamber, his face a mask of concern, his mouth moving. He looked small, insignificant. The light around him, the air he breathed, the ground he stood on, it was all a fragile illusion, a shimmering veil over the true, monstrous architecture of the cosmos. He couldn't see it. He couldn't feel the ancient ice core pulsating with the rhythm of a dreaming god. What would he see when he looked at me now? The cold in the glacier research camp, ancient ice core reveals impassable age, had always been a constant, a dull ache in my bones that I'd learned to ignore. It seeped into my thoughts, a crystalline lattice forming within my skull, sharp and intricate, replacing the soft give of my own memories with something brittle and vast. My fingers, when I looked at them, seemed to shimmer at the edges, not with frost, but with a faint, internal luminescence that pulsed in time with a rhythm I could only hear in the deepest recesses of my mind. It was a slow, grinding beat, like tectonic plates shifting beneath an ocean of frozen time. My vision blurred, then sharpened, no longer seeing the familiar contours of the research station. The corrugated metal walls of my small living module warped, stretched, becoming translucent. I saw through them, not to the snow outside, but to impassable geometries of light and shadow, vast structures that dwarfed galaxies, twisting and turning in a silent, cosmic dance. There was I seeing through the walls, or had the walls themselves become merely a thin membrane over a much larger, more terrifying reality? I tried to speak, to call out for the colleague who usually shared the mess hall, but my tongue felt thick, uncooperative. The sounds that emerged were not words, but a series of clicks and whistles, echoing strangely in the confined space. They were not my sounds. The realization didn't bring panic, not exactly. It brought a curious sense of inevitability, a quiet understanding that this was simply the next stage. My human body, my human mind, they were simply conduits, temporary vessels being reshaped, refined. For what purpose I couldn't yet grasp, but the intention felt grand. The floor beneath my boots vibrated, not the subtle hum of the generators, but a deeper, more organic tremor. The ice itself, hundreds of meters below, seemed to be shifting, breathing. Cracks spiderwebbed across the plexiglass window, but they weren't caused by stress. They were patterns, fractals forming and reforming, mirroring the crystalline structure that had taken root in my thoughts. Through them, the eternal twilight of the Antarctic day seemed to shimmer with new colors, impassable hues that shifted in and out of existence, painting the vast, white expanse with strokes of violet and sickly green. The world outside was dissolving, or perhaps it was finally revealing its true nature. I walked, or rather, I drifted towards the main core sample repository. My movements felt light, almost weightless, as if gravity had become a suggestion rather than a law. The corridor stretched before me, longer than it should have been, the emergency lights flickering with an erratic rhythm that pulsed with the beat in my skull. They seemed to press in, not with malice, but with an immense, indifferent curiosity. What were they observing? Reaching the core sample chamber, I found the massive ice drill still humming, though its noise was now a distant echo beneath the rising tide of internal sound. The giant ice core, extracted from miles beneath the surface, stood encased in its clear tube, a frozen pillar of eons. But it was no longer just ice. Within its depths, I saw swirling patterns of light, faint and ethereal, like distant nebulae trapped in amber. They pulsed, too, synchronizing with my own internal rhythm, drawing me closer. It hummed back, a vibration that resonated deep within my chest, bypassing bone and muscle, reaching something fundamental, something ancient. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't quite my face. My eyes, once a familiar brown, now held depths of shifting starlight, pupils dilated to encompass more than mere light. My skin was pallid, almost translucent, and beneath it, faint lines of light seemed to trace themselves, like circuits embedded within flesh. I was changing. The signal wasn't just influencing me, it was integrating me. I was becoming a part of it, a node in its incomprehensible network. And with that integration came a flood of understanding, not in words or concepts, but in pure, unfiltered sensation. It was teeming with entities so vast, so ancient, that stars were merely motes of dust in their wake. They didn't live in the universe as we understood it. They were the universe, fundamental constants given shape and sentience. The signal wasn't a message from them, but a vibration of them, a slow, cosmic hum that had finally reached a frequency my altered mind could perceive. Humanity, our history, our science, our very concept of existence, it was all a fleeting dream, a brief flicker in the vast, indifferent consciousness of these slumbering behemoths. We were an accidental resonance in their unending, silent song. The Glacier Research Camp, ancient ice core reveals impassable age, itself began to deform. The metal groaned, twisted, not collapsing but reconfiguring. The ceiling peeled back, not to the familiar gray sky, but to an expanse of shifting, impassable colors, a kaleidoscope of cosmic dust and distant, unfathomable light. It was beautiful, terrifyingly so. My body, my perception, my very being stretched and thinned, becoming part of the light, part of the hum. I was a point of awareness, a newly formed facet of something immeasurably grander, witnessing the true, terrible architecture of reality. What would remain of me once the transformation was complete?